Hello. So today I'm joined by a very special guest. We have with us Aditya, who is an animal welfare activist based in Hyderabad here in India. He currently is the program coordinator for animal ethics and animal welfare organization that follows effective altruist principles. He's been involved with grassroots activism since 2016 by an organization called Hyderabad Animal Save that works to combat speciesism. Aditya has done a lot of work on wild animal welfare advocacy as well. And so, for that reason, today we are going to discuss both activism in the animal welfare space, as well as wild animal welfare and what we should and can do in both of those spheres. So, to start us off, could you tell us a little bit about what the grassroots space looks like, who are the major players here in India, and how big are these organizations? What do they mainly do?
Great. Thank you, Karthik. So to talk a little bit more about the grassroots advocacy. So again, within the animal advocacy space is very broad, right? So there's within the animal advocacy space, there's like groups with more narrower goals. For example, there are groups focusing on wild animal conservation and wild animal protection. There's the farm animal protection group that, again, within farm animal protection, there's groups that work on improving the welfare, focusing on welfare reforms of animals, and the other which focuses on animal rights, like an abolitionist approach, where they ask for behavioral changes like veganism. And this is for farm animals. And then again, there's like the stray animal protection group, like the stray dogs, stray cats, pet dogs, pet cats, etc. So there's like these three categories that we'll have to consider when talking about grassroots. Because so far there's been no unified voice for animal rights as such. That we haven't seen like a group encompassing all of these categories. So to answer your question about what groups have been doing, I can maybe focus more on like the groups that have been working on anti-speciesism or something related, because I haven't been involved with the wild animal protection scene. I've been involved with the wild animal welfare, but not in the conservation space. So for farm animals, there are certain groups that have been working on advocating for veganism or welfare reforms. For veganism, say like there's the Animal Save movement, which is a Canada-based international group, and they have chapters here in India as well in different parts, in different cities, and they work on like educating the public through talks, seminars, different activities about why it's important to consider the suffering of farmed animals and why it's important for people. That's animal save movement. Similarly, there's also like something called Vegan India Movement, which is again a grassroots group that's not run by any organization as such, but this is people who have themselves cohered around this central cause, and they also have chapters across India. Apart from that, like there are multiple groups for like stray animal protection that are there, like mainly groups like People for Animals or HSI India, and HHA, which is like a group started by People Farm, which is an animal sanctuary in North India. So there have been many groups for stray animal protection that I'm aware of. And also, when talking about farm animal welfare reforms, there are these other groups that support grassroots activism, like PAPO, this Federation of Indian Animal Protection Organization. They have been supporting activists, funds, guidance, mentoring, etc. Similarly, there's also been vegan outreach. They do leafletting and giving talks in different cities. So they have also been helping. And there's also something called the Pollination Project to fund activists or anyone interested in creating like change for the animals in society. So they also fund. There have been many such groups funding and supporting activists. But if I talk about like a pan-India, like grassroots groups, the first two which I mentioned, the main ones. Um, yeah. And recently there was also like a campaign called No More 50, which was again supported by activist groups from different spaces, which is basically asking for a change in the penalty imposed on people who violate the animal protection laws, which is the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act. So for someone who abuses animals, the penalty is only 50 rupees, which is like ridiculous. So a lot of people have come together and want to say that no more 50, we need higher penalties to discourage people from engaging in animal cruelty. So yeah, this is like very broad.
Yeah. So you mentioned that there are a lot of these organizations. So is there cooperation that happens between these groups? So is that like sharing funding, sharing like media spaces, or do they all operate individually and on their own?
No, there definitely is collaboration happening among some groups that I mentioned, like PFA, HSI, People for Athletes, Kiapo, and the other groups. There are occasional conferences organized. For example, there's India for Animals conference where people come together and like, exchange information. And also, like for example, there's the animal protection law course that happens, and that's done like in collaboration with HSI and People for Animals. So yeah, there is definitely collaboration happening. However, not as much as one would like. That it's happening in like very how would I say? Um, it's not, the collaboration is not that common between some groups. Yes, there is a lot of collaboration, but yeah, there is still a lot of like divisions and fighting and stuff like that, which hinders the optimal amount of collaboration that should have a positive impact.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I wanted to focus more about the organization that you worked with, so Hyderabad Animal Save. So how many people does your organization's awareness campaign on speciesism reach?
Um, well, uh, to give a brief overview, like, we do multiple different activities, and not all of our activities are like we get feedback on how many people we are reaching out. Some of them, for example, media campaigns where we do like press conferences, etc. We don't have like feedback on how many people it's reaching out. And that is something which we are actually considering involving in our success metrics of our different activities on what to prioritize, etc., on how many people can we tentatively reach. However, during our usual like weekly street outreaches, we reach out to somewhere between 40 to 50 people each outreach. And we also give talks in schools and colleges for every school. Like we have collaborated with the city municipality to give talks at all government schools about animal welfare. So in each class there's like 60 kids, and then we give to like 3 grades. So there's that. So yeah, it depends on the events as well. If you are organizing like a larger event to draw public attention, then we invite celebrities, we invite media. So the reach is definitely higher there. And as I said, we don't have like uh, any reliable numbers on how many people we reach out to all our activities, but that is something that we are considering finding ways to analyze.
Yeah, so what's the goal with the increased awareness campaign? So it's hard to like convince everybody to like care about speciesism and combating it. So is it to find like 2 or 3 people who you're inspiring, or is it to like normalize discussions about it? Like what's the goal with advocacy like this?
Yeah, I think the latter, which you mentioned, is something that we're trying to do, which is to normalize discussions about animal welfare. Because right now, we are seeing many indicators of there being increased apathy, like increasing apathy to what happens to animals. So people are not aware of why it is important to care for animals, how to care for animals, and why it's important to even consider their interests. So to ensure that these conversations are being had, that this topic doesn't, fall out of like the mainstream is something that we are trying to make sure that through our activities, we are making sure that, animal welfare is part of the discussion, is part of the conversations. And talking about social justice, we're talking about improvement or development of like, I don't know, social indexes, etc. So we want to make sure that animal welfare is like an important topic that's not forgotten. So for that, we are using like a multi-pronged approach, whether it's to policymakers, to politicians, to like academics, the general public, school children, of course. So yeah, it's basically education, mass awareness campaigns that ensure that the topic
Yeah.
is relevant.
Right. So, one of the concerns with like a lot of advocacy is that it's very difficult to strike the balance between telling the truth and being blunt about animal suffering, and then also not wanting to distance people away from the movement and them, not wanting to associate with animal welfare at all. So, how does a movement go about striking this balance? And what is like some experiences that you could share about this?
Yeah, that's a interesting question. And so I believe in having like varying messaging for different kinds of audience. Of course, based on my research, there have been some scenarios where having consistent messaging works, like you use same messaging to different audiences. Like for example, the British anti-slavery movement, where they use like consistent messaging to create progress. But I think, as you said, for animal advocacy, it's a little tricky because not everyone is attracted by or is convinced by a certain concept. So I definitely believe that we need to approach it in a more nuanced way, considering how the audience that we're talking to would interpret the message that we're trying to send to them. Of course, we can create like maybe a journey of where these people will inevitably encounter the main issues that we want to talk about. But I think it's important to take a more strategic, nuanced approach when reaching out to people. And yes, it is a difficult task because we never know how people might. So I definitely feel in our messaging there should be certain non-negotiables, like for example, that animal interests do matter, that discriminating against animals is wrong, and there could be certain other negotiables that, depending on the sensitivity of the audience. For example, you talk to people who are not well off socioeconomically. You cannot go there and talk a lot about veganism because a lot of it is they aren't used to this kind of message. So it is important to take like uh, um, a more sensitive approach to them, where you first maybe talk about being kind to animals as the first step. Maybe having that conversation would be like a better first step than talking about animals need to have rights or go vegan or stuff like that. I hope I was able to communicate what I was.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, especially like making sure that advocacy is different depending on the target audience, and like kind of judging it on that basis is really interesting. So I've gone through the Instagram page of Hyderabad Animal Save, and I've seen some of their demonstrations. So they do a lot of stuff where they like go to people on the roads and they approach them and they talk about speciesism, about how we shouldn't contribute to the problem. And then there are also some demonstrations that are staged in the mall, right? So what has the response been from people? Because if you look at like YouTube videos about the same happening in the West, you see a lot of backlash towards activism in this way. Is that different in India?
Right. Um, yeah, I mean, okay. So even within the activist groups, there are different approaches. Like, for example, groups like DXC take a more confrontational approach, and there are other groups that do not take a confrontation. So we do not take a confrontation approach. We believe in a more love-based approach, inspired by the principles of Leo Tolstoy and Gandhi, etc. So there have been instances, of course, where we face backlash. We have done some activities that could be considered a little confrontational. However, we try to tone down because that is not in the principles. So there'll of course be some level of backlash, but we try to make sure that when we are having these conversations, we are having it from a more empathetic space, and not being too intrusive or too confrontational or too aggressive. Because at least we as a group believe that it's important to have like an understanding of what their needs are, where they're coming from, and then have conversation there. Of course, in some situations, maybe a show of aggression might help, like for during protests where you're asking for certain asks. But usually in our outreaches, we take a relatively non-violent communication form of approach. And yes, in the mall that you mentioned, so there we did like street theater, we invited celebrities, so we tried to make it big, and we tried to make sure that we were able to express the situation of animals in the animal agriculture industry. So we were more open there because we were being covered by the media, etc. Whereas if you're having like one-on-one discussions with the public, etc., we are polite and trying to have a more sensitive discussion. There's also some other activities which we do, which we call as vigils or bearing witness, where we go to the government slaughterhouses to document the suffering of animals in the slaughterhouses. Even there as well, like we do not engage in any confrontation with the slaughterhouse workers, etc., because the focus is on the animals to be, and a lot of people do turn up for vigils, right? And most of them are people who are not vegan who still consume animal products. And when they come to the slaughterhouses and interact with the animals, so there is a shift in the attitude that they usually have. So far, they've looked at animals as commodities, as objects. But when you come to the slaughterhouse and you engage with the emotions of the animals, you form a connection with them, and that changes the way you're perceiving sentient beings. So that's also another approach that we can take.
Yeah, so on like holding vigils for farm animals, so you mentioned that a lot of people do show up to this, but is it mainly people who already would call themselves people who are for animal rights who show up? So is it like people already within the movement, or are there also like people on the fence who show up? Like, how does this look like?
Yes, so you've had many people who are not pro animal, but who were interested in looking at how how these animals were being killed, what happens behind slaughterhouses. So even they were interested, and they didn't come with an intention to go vegan or anything. But a lot of people after the experience have shifted their stance on animal exploitation, and we've had many instances of people significantly changing their attitudes towards what happens to animals.
Yeah, that makes sense. So when you're holding vigils, and I think another thing that you guys do is vegan potlucks, right? Where you invite people over and people have vegan food. So a lot of these things engage people who are interested in animal rights and passionate about it. How important is it to engage members of the grassroots movement to keep them in the loop and concerned about animal welfare?
I'm sorry if I understood your question right. Are you asking how important is a grassroots group in the city for animal?
Yeah, so we have like members. We're trying. So a lot of the work we do is like try to like get people to care about animal welfare. But once we've got that to happen, so we've got people to like actually care. What do you then do? So some of the things obviously is like vegan potlucks, maybe holding vigils. So what does that really do in terms of engaging people in the movement?
Yeah, great question. So I think it's very important. Like when I went vegan, 10 years ago, like the community in Hyderabad was very small. There was no not enough resources that I could check out about locally how can I access vegan food, or how can I contribute to uh, suffering of animals. I mean, like contribute to the alleviation of suffering of animals. So I think community is very important, and as you said, once people get interested, there needs to be a way for them to contribute or engage with the cause area. So I think having like these regular touch points for people to come together, network, share ideas, and form collaborations. During these potlucks, many times people find project ideas they want to collaborate on, they end up working together, or just having a community, a support system, because it is. I mean, majority of the people are apathetic to the suffering of animals, so it can get pretty alienating and also mentally stressful when you do not have like that support system. So we believe it is important to have these social spaces for people with a common belief about this. So yeah, people come together and they have like sharing of ideas and bonding, etc. So yeah, so far we have like a very good turnout for events like this. So it shows that people do need to benefit from such events. So
yeah, so this is a question relating to this. So a lot of people who are very passionate about animal rights, because they feel really bad about what's going on, often face something called compassion fatigue, right? Which is that they can't keep grappling with the suffering, and so they soon start to like distance themselves away from it. So how does one navigate something like that, especially if they've been working on the issue for so long?
Yeah, that's a very important question as well. And compassion fatigue is very, very common among activists, as far as I have seen. And I have come to realize its importance on how important it is to deal with it, because a lot of activists come in with a lot of passion to do something, but they are not aware of, like being exposed to this violence, or, this realization of animal suffering causes a lot of stress, and then they end up getting exhausted and traumatized as well, being constantly looking at those videos talking about suffering of animals, and also because the society doesn't respond back how you want them, how you would like them to. That also makes you feel very disappointed and disconnected from the society, and that can have like a lot of negative consequences on your mental health. So it is very important, and to that end, as I said, it's important to not only have like these activism events. It's also important to have like these social spaces where people can come and positive environment where they are able to interact and with the community. There needs to be like a balance. Earlier, we would focus more on activism, but then we realized how important social spaces, positive social spaces with positive environment are. And also, it's important to stress taking breaks, because constantly doing activism can burn out anyone. In fact, even I've had situations where I felt like, as you mentioned, compassion fatigue or emotional stress. So it's very important to get help also if you are feeling, the need for, if you need support with regards to your mental health. So we at Hyderabad Save, we also collaborated with certain therapists who are sympathetic to the cause that we are fighting for. So because sometimes it is also important that the therapist understands where you're coming from. If you're talking about animal suffering, but they have no awareness of this issue, that can make the person who's receiving help feel like they're not connecting with the therapist. So we have some collaboration where if activists do face burnout, we connect them to our therapist. Yeah, overall, I think it's a very important issue, and we are trying to find ways of reducing the instances of burnouts. So, yeah, that's what I would respond.
Yeah, that makes sense. So my question now is about the groups themselves. So how do they get funding? So is it through like grants they get, donations? How does that kind of work?
Right. For Animal Save movement, yes, we do get grants from like international group. And now we are also registered in India as India Animal Health and Cancer Foundation. So we do fundraising, and whatever funds we get, we distribute it to chapters, and then they use it for activism related events. Yeah.
And yeah.
There are also other groups, like I mentioned, Wedge Pollination Project, that do fund grassroots activists.
That makes sense. And what is this funding mainly used for? So I know that in some of these larger, organizations, it could be used for things like lobbying, but for like a smaller grassroots group, what usually happens with the funding?
Yeah, it's mainly to organize events. Most grassroots activists are currently still either in college or they are early career, so they do not have access to a lot of financial resources. So uh, funding is mainly used for like I don't know, like printing leaflets, putting up stalls in events, um, printing play cards, etc. Whatever logistics are required to conduct the activities. That is mainly what it's used for, and also for transportation to different. So it's basically logistics, transportation, supporting the activists to join the events.
Mm. My next question is more about the advocacy itself and the thing that it's focusing on. So I see that a lot of animal rights groups they focus on veganism and promoting that. So my question is, veganism is often expensive for a lot of people because, especially in the developing world, there are a lack of plant-based alternatives. So would it make sense for them to not go vegan but spend the extra money on donating to an animal welfare charity instead? So there's like that other like consideration as well, right? Which is if they didn't go vegan, they would have donated that extra money they would have spent on the more expensive vegan milk or vegan food that they're getting. So like, what is your take on this idea?
Uh, so I believe it's more important to promote anti-speciesism, which is caring about the interests of animals, and then an implication of that might be that people make behavioral changes. So it's important to convince people that animal interests matter. That is what we do mainly during our activism or conversations. We try to convince people to reject the discrimination of animals. And then, yeah, as you said, veganism, like going vegan, has different challenges in different countries. I mean, people say that veganism is expensive, but in India we do have many options. Like at least in my experience, if you do not like buy all these like expensive brands of almond milk, etc., like most stuff that we find in India is plant based, and it is. I guess at least in my experience, many people have met throughout being vegan in the city have expressed and that it has been easy being vegan. But I can understand that for some people they might find difficulty going vegan. Um, Regarding your question on my opinion on donating the amount to animal charities as compared to for vegan, well, I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think one could try to reduce the like the number of or the amount of animal consumption they are doing, and at the same time donate to animal charities. I don't, as I mentioned, I don't think it is very expensive that that amount could be donated to an animal charity. In fact, I think in many situations it decreases the amount of money you're spending. Like, for example, I've stopped consuming butter, cheese, mayonnaise, and all these other things. I rarely do buy like the vegan options of those. And even if I do, like the price is almost similar. Um, so I don't think the amount is like or the amount that I save uh, by being vegan or the extra amount that might be for some people that they save by being vegan is large enough that they could donate to a charity. I mean, they could still donate to a charity. I'm always in favor of that. I think it's helpful that if you're donating to them, you could still have a positive impact on the situation of animals. But maybe one's own behavior can also influence the attitude. That's why I'm skeptical of completely relying on a strategy. For example, if I'm consuming animal products from factory farms, I there might be a case of cognitive dissonance where because of my attitudes, I might, or because of my behavior, I might consider animal interest to be not so important. So yeah, I mean, from a consequential viewpoint, yes, you're still having positive consequences, at least in the short term. But it might be the case that if they keep indulging in that behavior, they might inevitably not care much about that. So,
Yeah, that makes sense. So I was really interested in the thing you said about like promoting anti-speciesism and using that as like a starting point to get people to care about animals, because there are a lot of movements that talk more about reducitarianism, where they're like eat less meat, and they don't come from the starting point of you should care about the animals. So what would you say is the advantage of starting from be compassionate to animals?
I believe in first talking about that strongly, because I think focusing on behavior change might not be very effective. I think it is, in my experience, it's been more effective. And there's also some studies being done by Fuanalytics, which show how attitude change is a better catalyst for social change than behavior change. And I feel like because we will not be achieving like freedom for animals in the next 30 or 40 years. It's a long-term marathon. So we need to focus on attitude changes that can have like ripple effect into the long term. Yes, behavioral change can reinforce the attitudes. So yeah, like for example, with reducitarian, I am not I guess there are some really good reasons for choosing that strategy, but that is not something that I'm particularly convinced by. So I focus on like uh, the possibility of abstaining from animal product consumption, and at least for me, that is an approach that I follow. But I can see why people would choose to promote like a reducitarian diet. However, I feel like given the association of this being like a fad. So I feel it's risky, because if you give people the leeway to consume whatever they like, they might not give consideration to the suffering of animals, but they might just choose that label but not care about, like what's happening to animals. So that is one reason why I don't promote reduced dairy. Right? But regarding your point on starting anti-speciesism or compassion for animals as a starting point, I strongly believe in that, and I strongly advocate for that. Because most people do agree that we need to be compassionate to animals. So having more conversation starting from there is a much better approach, in my opinion. Yeah.
Yeah. So another question is, how does Hyderabad Animal Save set its priorities? So I see that there are posts about stray dogs, about cow suffering, and how people should give up milk, as well as chicken welfare, right? So this is a generalist approach. So you're looking at like various animals, different cases of suffering, and you're talking about all of that. There are some groups that focus specifically on one animal, and so I think there's also like some consensus, at least within the EA circle, that like the priority should be ending chicken suffering or egg related like suffering. So why might it be like useful for some movements to take a generalist approach as opposed to being very specific and focused? Yeah.
Right. Uh, so Hyderabad saves, at least so far, our theory of change has focused on like educating people about what is happening in the animal exploitation industry as such, for different, whether it's clothing, zoos, food related exploitation, working animals, etc. So we, for us, the what was important was to educate people about what is happening behind these products, like behind the act, like how to highlight the suffering of animals in different instances. And animal save movement is not related to effective altruism, so we don't focus a lot on like prioritization of like strategies, at least so far. Of course, we want to like head in a direction where we are prioritizing situations that are situations for animals that are the worst, and where we can have like a lot of impact. But yeah, like with, with example for animal ethics, it's different. But with Hyderabad Animal Save, it's mainly like we just try to address all the different forms of suffering. At the same time, at least in Hyderabad, there have been certain potentials, uh, 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 potential for collaboration with the municipality respect for dogs, or like the cock fighting, rooster fighting that happens some places in Telangana and Andhra Pradesh. So we have collaborated with them. So wherever there is a possibility for us to collaborate with the municipality or make any significant change, we do collaborate. While we are educating our Instagram audience about the exploitation in different industries, on ground, if there are certain forms of collaboration that we can do, whether it is for like recently we are doing we are considering doing a campaign for zoos where like some wild animals are being neglected in the zoo, so we want to do a campaign there. So again, wherever we find such areas where we can make like like what do you call that, where we have a fit for making an impact there, we do go ahead. So far, yeah, like wherever we can make progress as a group, but at the same time, we also cover different forms of exploitation. So yeah, that's how I would respond to that. But we don't have like a really concrete theory of change or theory of impact. But yeah, that's what.
Are there trade-offs that you would have to make? So if you're going to focus on, one thing, like as you said, if something comes up, so you're going to divert resources and attention to that issue and pull people away from like another issue. So are those things that Hyderabad Animal Save is cognizant of while it's doing?
Yeah, I guess. There has been that consideration raised that, okay, if we focus on one particular issue, then that might be taking away the rest. And I don't think we have a good personal fit as a group to be able to make significant changes on one particular thing. So that's why, and we are a relatively new group, right? We started in 2019. So we don't have like people with very strong background in your fields for any particular species, with the exception of a few people. So this is, the group is mainly of for people who are new to the space and who want to contribute. So they're mainly doing outreach on different things. But if a situation comes up where we want to focus on one particular thing, even though we are contributing to that, we make sure that it's not like 70% of our resources going into this. But it's probably more like 40 or 50. So we are parallelly also focusing on the work that we're usually doing while also working on this other campaign.
That makes a lot of sense. So I want to now move on to the next section, which is about wild animal welfare. So I guess my first question is, why do you think that it is more important than ever to focus on the issue of wild animal welfare and like kind of detail the view first, what is the problem that wild animals are facing?
Great. So, well, within the effective altruism, when we are deciding on how we prioritize which cause areas are important or more pressing, we use like the criteria of like the scale of the issue, and how neglected it is, and how attractive it is. So assuming that the audience is familiar with this criteria, I'm going to go ahead to the next step, which is based on these three criteria. If you look at the scale of the number of animals suffering, yes, animals exploited by humans, the scale is huge. But if you look just in terms of numbers, the number of farmed animals is tentatively expected to be around 10 to the power 11. And if you include also the animals, the marine animals that we farm, it's somewhere around 10 to the power 13. So it's like 70 billion land animals and 3 trillion aquatic animals that are affected, that are exploited by humans. But if you look at the scale, the number of animals that exist in the wild, it's somewhere around 10 to the power 19. That is just including the vertebrates. If you also include the invertebrates, the number is much higher. So that is the scale. And talking about the neglectedness of this issue. So before I talk about, like how neglected it is, maybe it's important to give the context about why we feel the suffering of animals in the wild is huge. So most people have an assumption that animals in the wild are living a life in harmony. They are having a lot of positive experiences. As long as humans do not interfere in the wild, they are having like a blissful, joyful life with very few instances of harm or whatever. But that is very far from the reality. because animals in the wild very routinely suffer from many negative conditions, whether it is starvation, disasters, weather-related conditions, diseases, parasites, conflicts between species and also within the species, and predation and many other such issues. And so usually, if you look at these animal documentaries, they romanticize the whole process of animals living in the wild and their lives, etc. But the reality is much more negative. Like the reality is where animals are suffering a lot, and also most animals reproduce in a way where they give birth to huge number of offspring, out of which very few end up surviving. So this is the population dynamics that is very prevalent in the wild. So like for example, many invertebrates, or consider the example of a frog, a bullfrog, which gives on average birth to around 10,000 tadpoles. And because for the ecosystem to remain stable, only a few of them can survive. 99% of them end up dying out of very harmful reasons, and very few of them end up surviving, less than 1% of them, which means that all the 99%, which may very well be sentient, they come into existence, they lead a very short life and have very few opportunities to have positive experiences, and they end up dying a very painful death. So majority of these animals die. And as I said, this this reproductive strategy is very prevalent among wild animals. So most species reproduce in such a way. Of course, there are other species which give birth to pure offsprings, like chimpanzees, elephants, gorillas, humans, which give birth to like pure offsprings and invest a lot of parental care such that these offspring survive to adulthood. So this gives us a reason that since majority of the animals in the wild reproduce in such a way, most animals that come into existence in the wild lead lives that are short, and they also die a painful death. So their lives are usually dominated by suffering. We have good reasons to assume that. Of course, more empirical research needs to be done to confirm this, but we have good. We can observe these patterns to come to. So yeah, like, and there are very few people talking about the neglectedness criteria. There are very few people trying to alleviate the suffering of animals in the wild. Most people who work in the wildlife space, they work on conserving the species, or protecting a certain form of ecosystem, or protecting the biodiversity, as opposed to caring about the well-being of the animals themselves. So when we take an anti-speciesist approach, when we reject speciesism, it doesn't matter if the harm caused to the animals is due to humans or due to nature. If there was a human suffering due to natural reasons, we wouldn't neglect the human, saying that whatever is natural needs to be followed. Similarly, even if animals are suffering in the wild, their suffering still matters. And if we can do something to help them, and if we choose not to do, that is still speciesism. Yeah, now that I've made the case, there's very few people working on this issue. There's 2 or 3 organizations that work on. I mean, there are independent initiatives that focus on helping a few wild animals. For example, the animals that are endangered or whatever. But it's not from like an anti-speciesist approach where they're going to care about the well-being of all the wild animals. So far, there's very few organizations. There's Wild Animal Initiative, and there's Animal Ethics and Meeting Priorities. There's just 3 organizations working on this issue. So it's a highly neglected issue. And yeah, also from the tractability point of view, there are many things that could be done using the knowledge that we already have about the lives of animals in the wild that we could do to help them. But because this issue is very less popular. I mean, many people are not aware about this issue, and so there's very less resources going into this cause area. So even though there's a lot that could be done due to a funding constraint, not much is being done. So yeah, based on these 3 criteria, like the tremendous astronomical scale of suffering that exists in the wild, very few organizations working on it, and the potential for creating progress, wild animal welfare is somewhere around the top for me, at least, based on these three criteria. Because, yeah, like, first of all, there's less advocacy for anti-speciesism, and within that, most people who even claim to be anti-speciesists are not aware about the suffering of wild animals. So, yeah, I think it is very, very important that people are aware about it and people consider the welfare of wild animals so we can make progress on it.
Yeah, so I would definitely agree with the importance and the neglectedness of wild animal welfare. But I still have a question about the tractability. So you mentioned something about like the reproductive methods that animals have, which is that they want to reproduce on scale, they want like a lot of offspring. So how exactly would preventing suffering in those kinds of cases work? I'm also sure that like there's a lot of suffering in terms of like the way that animals are preyed upon. Those are things that we can't really change much. So would it still be considered tractable enough for us to want to invest money into the space?
Right. Um, well, so if you look at it that way, so the issue is very huge that we cannot solve in the next 50 or 60 days. It is definitely a long-term cause area. And to create change, we first, like, for example, even for animal welfare science, or whether it was for, the science of ecology, we first need to create like a scientific field so that we can study the situation of animals in the wild and get enough understanding and information about what their lives are like, what are the different sources of suffering, how much they suffer due to each of these harms, and then prioritize, and then also find like the most reliable and effective ways in which we can help them. So to do this, we need like a proper scientific field to be able to, assist them in the sources of suffering. And again, I did mention reproductive strategy, but even though they do give birth to huge number of offsprings, the causes of harm or the causes of mortality are different. It could be parasitism, it could be diseases, it could be like predation or hunger, etc. So we do not know which of these forms of suffering which of these reasons of mortality causes the most amount of harm. So even for that, we need like research to go in there to understand which of them is causing the lot of harm. And then we need to prioritize. Right as of now, we don't have that information, but there is already a lot of work being done that could have positive impact for the animals in the wild. For example, like with vaccinating animals against diseases. So there have been many campaigns where, like for example, there have been some organizations working on vaccinating wild animals against rabies, and where they would have like these cookies, where they would put like the oral vaccine and drop them from helicopters. And due to such interventions, now large parts of North America and Europe are now free of rabies. Similarly, there have been similar vaccination programs in different countries against tuberculosis, foot and mouth disease, anthrax, etc. And also, we can see in cases of like natural disasters like forest fires or floods, there are organizations that work on rescuing animals during these disasters. So I mean, there's definitely things that we can do. At this point, what we need to focus on or invest our resources into within the cause area is on establishing a field of study so that we gain more information, and two, work on issues that can build more support for this cause area rather than working on things like, as you said, like predation or like the reproductive strategy, which might at this point be a little controversial. Focusing on causes of harms or ways of helping wild animals that are less controversial is probably a better approach to take right now, so that in the future we would have enough support to work on other issues as well. So that has been like a consensus in the strategy that most wild animal welfare organizations are using to basically get more support. So right now they invest funding into issues that can help them get more support in the long term.
Yeah, so one example of like an issue that could probably get them more support is like trying to end plastic that's being thrown into like oceans, which turtles and stuff like that. So my question is for stuff like this, right? We still don't know if a turtle dying due to choking on plastic is worse than being predated upon, right? So this is an example of something that isn't controversial, in that a lot of people do support and care about making sure that there's less plastic in the oceans, but it's still something we don't really know is actually better for the turtle. So should we still not invest in these kinds of causes, or should we do it just for the sake of support, which we can then use to like, segue into other areas as well?
Yeah, I think a better idea would be to find spaces of collaboration where we can find interventions that are supported both by like conservationists or due to anthropocentric reasons, as well as for animal welfare reasons. I also think it's important to emphasize why it is important to also care about the well-being of animals when we are trying to remove plastic from the oceans, as opposed to just conserving the species or whatever. It's important to bring the welfare of these animals into the discussion and like organize the intervention accordingly as opposed to just being done for anthropocentric reasons.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So my question now is, so just two things on this. So the first thing is, there are like probably objective things that we all agree we should do. So as you said, like maybe vaccinating against diseases, because diseases cause prolonged periods of suffering. So the length of time is something we would look at, or just second, things that are objectively painful, like a wildfire, that like we just know we wouldn't want any animal to go through. So maybe like picking things that we know for sure we should be working on, even though we might not have like the best information about what's the most suffering, can still be done, right?
Exactly. So as I said, it's right now it's important to get more discussion about the welfare of animals out there among the academics, among the people who are in the animal protection space. So once we have this information, and to get this information out there, it doesn't matter on focusing on like the issues that cause the most amount of suffering. Yes, as EA organizations, we can always work on that, but to get this information out there and to make it like a credible area to work on, it is important to find areas of collaboration that might not necessarily be like the most pressing from wild animal welfare point of view, but might nevertheless still be a significant win in the long term to create more support, etc. But because if we start focusing on the more controversial, limit ourselves to only the effective or the most pressing sources of harm for wild animals, then we might lose out on other like opportunities which could have helped the cause area grow, get more resources.
Yeah. So now I want to ask questions that pertain to both like the activism stuff as well as the wild animal welfare space. So I guess my first question is, a lot of governments, as you said, already invest heavily upon in conserving keystone species. So China with pandas, India with the Bengal tiger. So we all know that conservationism might not be great for animal welfare, but are there still trickle down benefits? So for example, like conserving the area around a Bengal tiger might help other species nearby. Like, what does that look like? What kind of things can we do to like latch on to existing support?
Right. I am skeptical or I'm pessimistic about the feeling that conservationism might be what is better for from an animal welfare point of view as well. Because as we've seen, like most conservationists have like a more ecocentrist approach, like, and there's also like certain amount of status quo bias where they believe that whatever is there in the ecosystem right now is what is the best for it. Without there having been like a proper like analysis on what the well-being animals there is like. So the welfare metric that they take into consideration is what is natural for animals is what is best for them, which is not true. The approach that we take is like what their subjective experiences are like, how much pleasure or positive experiences versus negative experience they're facing. So that is different from the welfare metric that they use. So of course, again, there might be like points of collaboration between the wild animal welfare space and the conservation space. Like, for example, protecting the larger herbivores like elephants or rhinos. So the reason why I say that is these larger herbivores consume a lot of biomass, and if this biomass is not consumed by them, then that would cause a lot more smaller species to come into existence, which reproduce in ways that might lead to an increase in the amount of suffering in the wild, like the smaller invertebrates that reproduce in higher number. So due to the existence of these larger herbivores, the amount of biomass is controlled, which reduces the overall amount of suffering. So that could be one potential area of collaboration. And two would be, for example, so a lot of conservationists or environmentalists advocate for reforestation. Uh, so they go to these lands that were either degraded or that are being destroyed for 100% reasons, and they ask for like reforesting that. So what one could do if we want to bring in the discussion of wild animal welfare there is, because this ecosystem is anyway being designed by humans, like the reforestation, they are going to design. So we can try to ask for animal welfare to also be a consideration on how they are going to do the reforestation, whether it is the types of trees or plants they choose, the type of design they have for the reforestation, etc., or what species are introduced there, whatever. So if we have like animal welfare as a core consideration, then the design for the reforestation would be different than what it would have been if it was not, or if it was done mainly for conservationist or environmentalist reasons. So yeah, these are some examples of collaboration between people who care about wild animal welfare and environmentalists.
Yeah. So the second question's quite similar, but it's about the environmental movement. So we've talked about collaboration with different animal rights and welfare organizations, but my question is, there is this argument that says that we don't know if climate change is good or bad for animal welfare, for the reason that it could lead to new species emerging afterwards. I mean, the course of history has just shown that climate change has happened, right? We've gone from the ice age to what we are now, and we have different species. And so even if, let's say, we don't have species in the present existing in the future, that could lead to more possibly insects. So my question is, to what extent can the animal welfare group collaborate with environmentalists? Because I also know that there are some disagreements on priorities. I'm sure that the animal welfare groups care a lot about chicken welfare, whereas I'm sure environmentalist groups care about beef bans in other countries because they lead to the most carbon emissions. So is there also scope for collaboration?
I personally would think that there might be a reason why people working in the environmental space might also want to focus on animal welfare, but I don't think that the goals converge a lot, because ours is focused on animal welfare, and as we've seen, we are not sure if climate change would have a positive or negative impact so far. But I definitely don't think it's a bad idea that people who are environmentalists speak about veganism or animal welfare, but I am also a little hesitant, because it would be a case of suspicious convergence if we both are talking about this space for different reasons. And I think animal welfare essentially is non-speciesist, whereas talking mainly about climate change for human benefits is again anthropocentric. But of course, climate change can have implications which are significantly bad for non-humans as well, like in wildfires, floods, etc. So maybe a space of collaboration would be talking about the harms of climate change for non-human animals and stressing on that part where we are talking about animal welfare. And as you said, focusing solely on the animal suffering from like a climate carbon footprint point of view would cause us to prioritize like I don't know like emissions by cows and the cattle more than like hens, whereas like the suffering that exists in like, poultry farming is much higher than for cattle or even for aquaculture, etc. So if we take like a suffering focused view, then we would end up prioritizing the smaller animals like the fishes, the invertebrates, the hens. And if we take like a climate angle, I mean, that could have like a ripple, I mean, like flow through effects that cause people to care about animals. But I'm really not sure about this. I think there are reasons both for and against, but I definitely think there should be some areas of collaboration that where both the animal welfare as well as like their goals, climate goals or the environmentalist goals are represented. But I'm not really very sure about that.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I want to now like wrap up with some personal questions. So I guess my first is, what got you to care about animal welfare? Tell us your background. What's your story?
Great, sure. Yeah, like I got involved with the animal protection space somewhere around 2013, 2014, where I got into like animal rescues, volunteering with the local animal rescue organizations, and then I realized like the scale of farm animal suffering, and I decided I would like to be involved in that space more because the number of people who are involved in farm animal protection is very less. So I became more involved in vegan advocacy and started volunteering and working with organizations working in that space, like PIAPO, Mercy for Animals, HSI, etc. And then I did my studies in animal protection law from Nalsar. Um, and then I started working with animal ethics. So my introduction was mainly because after watching, like it was mainly due to my dog, I must say, because having this connection with my dog changed the attitude that I have about the emotions of animals. Something I think it got me a much closer view at their lives, their emotional lives, which I had very much underestimated. And through there, I was able to like extrapolate and connect with something of other animals as well. While empathy is what helped me connect with the suffering of other animals, currently I place less stress on using empathy as a way of connecting people to the suffering of animals and more about recognizing the sentience of animals as a means for that. Because, for example, with smaller animals like insects, it might be hard for us to empathize with them, but their suffering matters nonetheless. So, and some people might end up empathizing with some species and not with the others based on how relatable they are to humans. So for those reasons, I think it's important to ask for consideration of animals based on the sentience as opposed to based on empathy, etc. Yeah, so after my studies in animal protection law, I started working with animal ethics. I was involved with like grassroots activism since 2016, but I started working with animal ethics since 2018, and I've been working with them since. Um, yes, apart from that, I've been involved in like discussions on effective animal advocacy and also been part of effective altruism, where I have been involved talking about effective forms of animal advocacy, collaborating with charities for effective altruism and welfare. Yeah,
Yeah.
so that's pretty much it.
Yeah. The next question is, what is a day in the life of the program director at Animal Ethics like, for people who just want to know what it is like to like work in the space?
Great, thanks. Interesting question. I've never been asked that, but so my role involves uh, coordinating volunteers and interns who work with animal ethics, like coordinating the research, coordinating the translations. So we do translate the content on animal ethics website into multiple different languages. So we have people who are translating into different languages. So I'm coordinating with them, reviewing them, giving them text. I'm also coordinating research. So there's a while that goes into like giving feedback to researchers. Apart from that, I'm very often giving talks to different conferences, to animal activists, to EAs at universities. So there's a part of my work which involves coordinating with institutions or groups and setting up talks and giving talks there. Unless I have many other calls where I'm helping people wanting to get involved with animal ethics or with wild animal welfare and giving them feedback and suggestions. Um, yeah, and that is with animal ethics, but of course with Hyderabad Animal Save, I'm also coordinating with other organizers to come up with events and to coordinate, like the different partnerships or collaborations we are having with municipalities, other groups, etc. Uh, yeah, that is what I do most of the time. And, yeah.
Yeah. So what is something that I guess what's like a challenge working in this space? So we've talked about compassion fatigue, right? Is there something that's really hard that you face working in animal welfare?
Well, yeah, I'm glad you mentioned compassion fatigue because there's many reasons why one feels fatigue and burnt out because one is definitely the community is not that big. There's very few people that you can connect with, and yeah, there's definitely that aspect. But apart from that, I think what is challenging is a lot of open questions, and the goal that we are fighting for is. Uh, very big and we have a lot of resistance in achieving that goal. There's many open-ended questions which we don't have answers for yet. There's unknown unknowns for a lot of within the cause area as well. So to form like a strong theory of change, we do not have enough information and we do not have enough data as well on how the animal agriculture, the animal exploitation industry is growing. Um, and yeah, and also because this issue is relatively unpopular, it's very hard to get people interested to work on this cause area. So finding ways of like how to convince people, how to keep the activists motivated, um, finding that strategy, so that we can achieve a goal or have these milestones, uh, achieve those milestones. So yeah, like I guess these questions are what are challenging, not necessarily in a negative way, but more like they keep us motivated to keep going. And yeah, I would say, and also funding is definitely an issue for most animal activists and organizations working on this space. I guess there was like this infographic where they show that like animal welfare is like in a minority if you compare like all the like where the philanthropic funding goes, and even within the animal welfare space, like farmed animals receive like less than 6% of the funding, like 95% goes to wild animals, pet animals, laboratory animals. So 5% comes to like farm animals, and if you look at wild animal welfare, it's less than 1%, much less than 1%. So the amount of funding going there is minuscule compared to how much is available out there. So that definitely affects how active or like the kind of campaigns that you can do for advancing the interests of animals. So yeah, I think we definitely need more talent. Talent is another challenge that we as a cause area face because most people do not find, as I said, funding constraint causes people causes there to be a shortage of funding to fund talent to join this cause area. And most people don't think of this as like a viable career path, which also affects the amount of progress we can do in this cause area. So I think all of these are like some of the challenges I think we face as a cause area.
Yeah. And what would be some advice you would give to someone who wants to work in animal welfare?
Great question. I love this because I think there's many things that one could do. One is I would suggest they focus on reading a lot of literature that exists out there. There's a lot of readings. I would suggest they check out resources by Sentience Institute, Animal Think Tank, and they publish some really good reading lists that you could check out. Of course, you could also check out the classic animal animal activism readings like Animal Liberation by Peter Singer, Gary Francione, Tom Regan, etc. I would the first step I would suggest is you basically educate yourself about the strategic approaches one could take to advance the movement. And after that, I would suggest they volunteer with organizations working there to find their personal fit. where they feel like they're able to contribute the most and where they find the most personal satisfaction as well in contributing to the space. And then, yeah, and from there, maybe you could decide if you would like to be completely involved with, you want your career to be completely focused on animal advocacy, or you would like to hedge between animal advocacy and other cause area. Um, and yeah, I think that's how I would suggest going about it.
Yeah. So I just wanted to say thank you so much for making time for today's interview. I know like we overshot by like 15 minutes, but you are someone who is truly inspiring, very insightful, and it's been a genuine honor and joy having hosted you today. And I hope we'll get like a chance to meet someday and continue discussing these issues. And let's all hope that we can do our part to end animal suffering in the world.
Thank you so much for the questions and inviting me. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much.